coordinate the ARC table with Tara in Emerald Cities.
Therese.
Hi, I'm Therese Tuttle, Principal Tuttle Law Group.
And I'm Sushil Jacob. I'm an attorney at Tuttle Law Group.
And I'm Allison Lingane, co-founder of Project Equity. I just wanted to share a quick note about the webinar platform, which is that all of you folks who are joining us today are in a listen-only mode, so you're muted. And when we get to the discussion part of the webinar and the Q&A session, I will go ahead and unmute you all so that we can hear your voices and participate together in conversation. Great, next slide. So our agenda today is that we're going to introduce to you very briefly ARC and then the regional project MyC. Again, very briefly, because this is really about the learning of the legal structures. For those of you who don't know about ARC, there's a lot of information available on the Emerald Cities website, and there's videos and materials, as well as Healthcare Without Harm has materials, so feel free to reach out to us so that you can get a larger context of this initiative, which it's been about 3 years now in development. Today we're going to talk about two congruent components. We're going to separate it into the Richmond production facility and the ecosystems of small food-related micro businesses and the producers co-op. And then we're going to dive a little deeper, although still keeping it on a relatively surface level, around community ownership legal structures, which will be presented by Project Equity and the Tuttle Law Group, then open for Q&A, and then what our next steps are. Next slide. So again, a brief introduction of ARC and how we found ourselves with MyC. ARC anchors in resilient communities. The definition of the mission is to leverage the assets and the capacities of East Bay institution anchors to improve the health, local economy, and climate resilience of underserved neighborhoods in Richmond and Oakland. And the ARC target is to actually target social determinants of health and well-being with a focus on expanding jobs, health outcomes, and community resilience. In brief, Emerald Cities' role has been to look at leveraging development policies and policies to target equity, high-wage union jobs, and community ownership, and also facilitating ways in which minority business can participate in the economy. Over our 7 years, we have been primarily working in the public infrastructure. We've been with municipalities and universities and schools, but we weren't able to actually find a way to leverage the power of health institutions. And here in the East Bay and in San Francisco, we have strong health institutions. So recognizing a great partner in that industry, Healthcare Without Harm, which has over 20 years of experience in greening the health sector, we thought we would leverage our dual partnership with the Affordable Care Act that was coming down the line. So 4 years ago, Gary Cohen and Denise Fairchild said, how can we blend our mutual goals and align them in a way that we can target the power of procurement of institutions and get to these social determinants of health. And when we sat and we met, it was clear that the East Bay was one of the most strongly vetted national sites because of all the generative work that has happened here with the community advocacy and the policies that were already in place with food, energy, equity, and climate resilience. We invited the Democracy Collaborative to help us do an assessment, and so over a year and a half, they did an exhaustive assessment of over 200 interviews in which we were going to look at the supply need of these institutions and how they were not met, and in which ways we could look at the capacity of the cities to actually meet the demand, what was already existing, and then what could be lifted up and built. The research report, when it was finalized, came up with 3 sectors that had a lot of alignment along the institutions where their procurement needs were unmet, and that was in energy, food, and green business. What was fortuitous and synchronistic was that one of our key partners, Kaiser Permanente, who is on our advisory board, brought a vendor who's been working with Kaiser and said, this vendor, food service partner, has similar intent around meeting our policy goals. And they introduced us to the MyC project. And it quickly, the momentum quickly went forward, and we saw a lot of alignment with similar principles and an intent around community empowerment. Next slide. And this will be Lucia.
Yeah, so as Emerald Cities Collaborative was working and establishing relationships in the East Bay communities of Oakland and Richmond and San Francisco, other places, Healthcare Without Harm for the past 10 years has been developing a program called Healthy Food in Healthcare. And we got our start really looking at improving food service operations within healthcare institutions that wanted to move towards more sustainable food service. And with the passage of the ACA and a much more of a focus on upstream investments and preventative investments, hospitals really are interested now in looking beyond their four walls and what can they do with a combination of their procurement dollars but also their investments. And so we call it localizing the food economy, and 4 of the sort of activities that we are supporting and promoting through these upstream investments is about aggregating the demand for healthy food products, increasing community access to healthy foods, creating jobs for community residents, and increasing the markets for local producers. So this is going way above and beyond acute food insecurity to looking at all of the steps along the way in the food system and how can we localize as many of those as possible and really help to put the sort of power and ownership of these different activities back into the communities that we serve. And so ECC and Healthcare Without Harm complement each other nicely, in particular on this food regional food project.
Next slide. So the next couple of slides will be focusing mostly on MyC Richmond Production Facility and what's fixed and what's open. Next slide. So what we know, and so we really want to create what's actually fixed and what we know is happening at this very moment in time. That the Richmond site is estimated to open September 2017. We have construction happening, and that the lease that is held is for 10 years with a renewal of 5-year, an option for 5 years. We have just graduated 20 union jobs. And they're starting next week. In fact, there's a ceremony this week and next week for the graduates. And there's a target and a forecast of 80 to 100 jobs to come through the Richmond facility by December. This is initially owned by the food service partner, which is based in San Francisco. And they are going to then hold the subsidiary, which is in Richmond. And we won't go into deep detail on this right now, but FSP is the entity that has the contracts with the anchors and the health institutions. That the ownership transition we want to initiate this summer, and that is actually going to be designing and understanding different ways that ownership can occur, and that this is restricted to the degree that FSP has union contracts, financing, and debt obligations, but that the entity, MyC, will actually become its legal structure and be formalized early January, but it will open in the summer, fall of 2018. Next slide, please. And so what is currently open for input from different experts and community partners? This does have some limitations. For example, again, the community ownership is yet to be determined because there's limitations around contracts, financing, and debt obligations. However, what is open that we are really requiring, requesting, and advocating for is the support of community around the hires that are coming up, 60 to 80 people, the cultural design and staff capacity building of the ownership model, the mapping and the building of the workforce pathways, and then MyC's capacity to support vendor innovation and scaling, which includes reaching out and creating this producers hub and getting produce from local and urban farmers. Next slide. So here's just the sort of visual of that, because some people hear things differently when they see, as well as when there is a visual a design versus the language. So again, we are here at the beginning, sort of at the beginning of 2017. We're going into May, and that's when we want to actually look at the ownership design. We want to, or hope to, complete the design by November, and then be able to build in a legal structure that will hold all of the visions and the goals. Simultaneously, and I'm imagining this is when the new employees come from their San Francisco facility and land in Richmond. Around September, we want to actually start the design of the ownership and culture capacity of the employees to be owners, because it's not something that just happens. There's a lot of integration and knowledge that has to take place. Next slide. And then I'm passing this on to our legal experts and Project Equity with their knowledge. So just to give a little more context, is that we really want to highlight that FSP, one of the things that really made us great partners and we wanted to work with them, is that they already have strong union relationships. So the employees will get better pay and benefits, assets to ownership, and a voice in decision making. That with this new project development, that we hope to support businesses, local businesses, with higher productivity and growth. That in turn will have a lower employee turnover and improve the longevity. And again, this is really looking at the multiplier for the city of Richmond, but for the East Bay as well, because these sector-related businesses are not just localized to one city. So the society at large will have a higher correlation with social benefits, and this is really important to our health anchors. Next slide.
Hey, thanks, Tara. So, so this is Allison from Project Equity. So we know the employee ownership, and we're using a shorthand for employee ownership that can also incorporate some broader community stakeholders in that ownership. But we know that there's a lot of these benefits, and the question is, well, how do we realize the benefits? Well, it really requires, as Tara's already touched on, both a structure so that the business itself is structured with ownership and an ownership culture. And so today we're going to be digging into what are some of the options around employee ownership companies and how they can be structured, knowing that there's lots of conversation and lots of work to be done around the culture, and that will come next. That will come later. So I often, when I talk about employee ownership, I can help to lay the groundwork around what are some of the different models. And since we're also today talking a little bit about a producer co-op, we'll get to that later in the conversation. I start with this. There's these two forms of very socially beneficial business models. One is a cooperative, which is a business that is owned and governed by its members. And so in a housing co-op, that co-op is owned and governed by its residents. In a producer co-op, it's owned and governed by the producers. So it could be farmers, it could be small-scale producers of value-added products. So the producer co-op. In the case of a worker-owned cooperative, it's a business that is owned and governed by and for the benefit of its workers. So worker-owned cooperatives are one of several forms of employee ownership. And the ones in red are the ones we're going to be talking about today: employee stock ownership plans, or ESOPs for short, and employee benefit trusts. So again, this is just a primer to set the context, really an educational session to kind of get people's heads into what some of the possibilities are. And then there'll be some deeper thinking in terms of what actually is a fit with MyC, given the constraints that Tara outlined. Okay, so these are the 4 structures we're going to go through: a worker-owned co-op, an ESOP, what's called a democratic ESOP, and then a trust. So before I go into, I'm going to start with worker-owned cooperative. But when we talk about ownership, it's often helpful to tease out, well, what do we mean by that? And there's really there's 3 components that we often really focus in on. And so as we talk about each of these different structures, we want to have you keep these 3 components in mind. So the first 2 are really financial. So when you own something, you own a business, one of the benefits is that you get the profits or the losses of that business. So financial ownership in thinking about profit sharing. The second component is financial ownership in terms of the value of the underlying business or its stock. So, you know, if you think about Apple, like what's the value of Apple today? Well, the people who own Apple benefit as Apple becomes more valuable. So that's the second one in terms of financial ownership. And then the third is control. So who's making the decisions, who has input into what decisions, and who is taking responsibility for having the control and being able to make those decisions. So keep those 3 in mind: financial profit sharing, financial value of the underlying business, and then control. So a worker-owned cooperative is, again, a business owned and governed by and for the benefit of its workers. It's 100% owned and 100% controlled by the workers. And the way it's structured is that every worker owner has a single share of voting stock. And with that stock it's a 1 worker, 1 vote. And so with that vote, they elect the board of directors. And the board of directors is made up of a majority of worker owners. And we typically recommend that the boards also have outside board seats so that you can bring in some strategic knowledge or connections or otherwise that might not exist within the company. But if you had a board of 5 people, it would be at least 3 worker owners, so that all decisions, you've got 3 worker owners making up the majority. The worker owners also participate in other really important strategic decisions, and for the purposes of thinking of a company that will be the size of what MyC will be growing to, 80, 100, or even more employees. Typically, the worker owners elect the board, and then the board oversees the management. So you've got a traditional hierarchical management structure. So the worker owners get to wear the hat during their day-to-day of whatever their role is, whether it's a management role or a line role. And then they wear the hat of being an owner when they do things like elect the board of directors. So some other just notes here. In a worker-owned cooperative, most typically it's structured so that the employee stock does not appreciate. So again, back to those 3 components of ownership. We've got profit sharing via patronage, but the underlying asset of the business ownership doesn't appreciate. But the workers build assets through having their own internal capital account. So they've got a affordable financial buy-in that they put up at the start to become a worker owner. And then over time, there may be some profits that the company retains within the business for working capital that sit in that employee's capital account. So employees can build up the asset of within their capital account over time. So worker-owned co-op, relative to other forms of employee ownership, is less expensive to set up. And then thinking about it from the perspective of FSP, who will initially be the owner of MyC, this will be an ownership transition. And so if it's structured as a sale at the point of that ownership transition, there may be some potential tax breaks to FSP, to the seller. So also it's really a fit for any size company, from very small to very, very large. So that's the first type of employee ownership structure, a worker-owned cooperative. The second type is an ESOP, Employee Stock Ownership Plan. And an ESOP is, in an ESOP, it's all or a subset or a portion of the company's shares are held in a trust on behalf of the employees. So I'm going to go through those three components of ownership. So from the financial ownership and profit sharing, ESOPs don't have profit sharing structurally built into the model, but many ESOPs do have profit sharing programs that they implement, but it's not a requirement of the model. In terms of the financial ownership and the potential appreciation or depreciation of the underlying stock, ESOPs do have stock do appreciate. So if the company grows and becomes more valuable, the underlying financial asset of that stock can also grow and become more valuable. And then the third being control. An ESOP in its does not have any control structurally built into the model. So the important thing on this graphic that we've got on the screen right now to note is you see the employees on the right, so they're shareholders, again, through the trust. And you see there's this dotted line where you've got the trustee representing the employees, but there's nothing where the employees are directly controlling the business and the business entity. So some additional details about ESOPs. ESOPs have potentially some very significant tax benefits, both to the company and so therefore to its employee owners, and to, again, in that moment of ownership transition, if it's structured as a sale, potentially also to FSP. And so because these are federal tax benefits, the federal government also carefully regulates ESOPs. So they're officially a retirement benefit regulated by ERISA and the Department of Labor. And so because of that regulation, they have high setup and ongoing costs. And ongoing, there's a business valuation that is required, a third-party business valuation. So cost estimates can vary, you know, in terms of the setup, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 is not abnormal. And then the annual valuation can be, you know, $20,000 or $30,000. The annual requirements can be $20,000 or $30,000. So at a very high level, that's an ESOP, the second form of the second structure of employee ownership. The third structure is a variation on an ESOP, and it's called a democratic ESOP. And it's essentially takes all of the components of what an ESOP is, but layers on top of that some democratic control and input from the employees. So you see on this graphic, you see now coming out of the big employee circle, you have an arrow coming out where the employees direct the trustee at the top. The trustee is the one that holds the stock in the trust on behalf of the employees. And then on the bottom, you have the employees elect the board of directors. So it sort of combines some of the components of a democratic company that are in a worker-owned cooperative with the components of the ESOP. And so given that the ESOP has some really important tax benefits, and given that the ESOP has the underlying stock appreciating, there are some differences that make this model worth having on the list of ones that is being considered. So yeah, I think I've covered everything on this slide. So the tax advantages to the company is that if it's 100% ESOP, and in a democratic ESOP, that would be the expectation that it's 100% ESOP, and if it's an S Corp, it pays no corporate income tax. So that benefit, you know, directly impacts the employee owners and directly impacts the financial investors as well. So that's the third of our 4 types of structures, and with that, I will pass it on to Tuttle.
Great, thank you so much, Allison. The fourth structure is often referred to as an employee benefit trust, and if you notice that this slide is a little bit more boxy than the previous diagrams, which were favoring circles. The employee benefit trust is actually quite similar to a democratic ESOP. So if you don't mind going back 2 slides to the democratic ESOP picture. So you see in the democratic ESOP, you have the employees, they're called the shareholders through a trust. Then you have the trustee, and then you have the company. The company has a board of directors, management. The major difference with the employee benefit trust is that the employees are not shareholders through the trust. The trustee is the shareholder of the company. It's usually the sole shareholder, owns all the outstanding shares of the company, and it controls the company for the benefit of the employees. The employees, okay, yeah, so we'll go forward to my slide. So the employees in this sense, in the structure, are the beneficiaries of the trust. Some other important differences from a democratic ESOP is that in the employee benefit trust structure, it is not regulated by ERISA, which is the Employment Retirement Income and Security Act. It is not a qualified or tax advantaged benefit plan, so it's not subject to ERISA and Department of Labor regulations, as well as specific ERISA IRS regulations. So it is much cheaper to administer. It does not require an annual valuation that an ESOP would require. There's some other features of the employee benefit trust that can allow it to be integrated tightly with the community. So if you see here, we put FSP as the settlor. That means FSP is creating the trust by putting some assets into the trust. And FSP is the initial owner of MyC Richmond, but over time, ownership transfers to the trust, which we'll talk about on the next slide. But in this model, you have the roles that can be played by the trust protector and a community advisory board, which itself can be connected to or in concert with a community nonprofit. And their role is to oversee the trustee, to make sure the trustee is acting in the long-term benefit of the workers. You can make employee benefit trusts very democratic, similar to democratic ESOPs, in that the beneficiaries, the employees, can direct the trustee in various matters, including in electing the board of directors of the company, MyC Richmond. And so, in short, the employee benefit trust is a different way of organizing an employee-controlled company, but it takes the share ownership out of the hands of the employees. And rather, the employees work for the company, and the trustee looks after their interests. And the trustee is responsible for making sure that the management of the company is operating for the benefit of the workers. So we'll go to the next slide. This is an example of a 10-year vesting timeline. By a vesting timeline, we mean a timeline by which ownership of MyC Richmond would be transferred from FSP to one of these entities. In this example, we refer to the trust. So we say years 1 to 5, FSP owns MyC Richmond. In year 5, the vesting cycle begins, and shares of MyC Richmond are purchased by the trust. In year 10, the purchase is complete. MyC Richmond now is completely owned by the trust, and it issues a promissory note for the balance of the sale price. So there's still some value to be paid off, but that is going to be paid off in the form of a note to FSP, which is then paid off in years 10 through 15. So if you go to the next slide, you can see what this looks like in terms of years. When we start, we're talking about starting here 2017. 2022 is when the 5-year vesting cycle would begin. 2027 is when MyC Richmond would be purchased outright by the trust, and then there'd be a promissory note which would then be paid off in 2032. We can return to these questions. This is an example, and nothing's been set in stone yet, but we want to show you what potential transfer could look like. And unless anybody else, any of the other presenters want to comment here, we can come back to this in the discussion section and move forward to the next slide.
There's only one. This is Tara. There's one thing I would just want to reiterate on that. And thank you, Sushil and Therese and Allison, for putting this in. For those, there are the FSP partners. There's some FSP partners on the line listening in. Again, this is not yet structured, so this is what we know, and it was our best assumption given the conversations that we have participated in. And so helping Tuttle and Project Equity to design this, but it's still open for construct. Thanks.
Great, thanks to you both. This is Allison. I can just jump back in again. So we put together this sort of comparison slide. The 4 different types of structures we just walked through are across the top: worker co-op, democratic ESOP, and trust. And just pulled out some of the characteristics of them to give you a sense. And everyone who's registered for the webinar will receive a copy of the slide deck, so you don't need to worry about copying this down or really interpreting it in its full detail right now. Know that you'll get this in your inbox and you can look at it and mull it over in more detail later on. Okay, so back to Tara.
Well, great. This is Lucia. Thanks, Allison and Sushil. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit. Tara mentioned at the beginning about our agenda that we were going to cover 2 congruent components. And we've talked about the MyC Richmond production facility, which, as Allison explained, is going to be transitioning into some form of community ownership, still to be determined and discussed and created. The second component, which can happen here alongside the ownership decisions about the production facility, and that is what we call the ecosystem of a whole host of small food-related micro businesses and a producers cooperative that can be being set up to provide food products, and other things and services for the Richmond production facility. So, and these can be 100% community owned and developed within the community from the get-go. So next slide. So just to give a little bit of a background of what we know and what is fixed around this concept of an ecosystem of food businesses. The first thing is that we have a very, very high volume of demand for sustainably grown, locally grown food and food products within the existing facility, which is in South San Francisco, and that is going to expand 2 to 3 times the size with the opening of the Richmond facility. So we're talking about a very, very large issue and opportunity of scale. So just to give you some examples of, these are some 2016 annual volumes for a few products that Food Service Partners is currently sourcing into their existing facility. So this is not including what will happen in Richmond, but just at this point, carrots, for example, close to 22,000 pounds of carrots a year. Spring mix, close to 26,000 pounds of spring mix per year. And broccoli florets, close to 32,500 pounds of product per year. And I can tell you that when I asked FSP for some of the volume numbers, these 3 were in a list of close to 80 different produce items, including herbs and vegetables and such. So the issue of scale and the opportunity of scale is large and known. We know that because of these institutional contracts up front, and because the menus are developed ahead of time, we know what these volumes are going to be for the Richmond facility. The second thing we know is that there's a very wide variety of product needs. So these are a few examples of produce items, but because of the commitment to 100%, trying to get to 100% local and sustainably sourced for all of the components in these meals and food products, we're talking about eggs and poultry and dairy, vegetables and fruit. So there's a very wide variety of product needs that come along with these institutional contracts. And the third thing is we have these institutional commitments to sustainability, community health, and community wealth established. We have healthcare systems that have committed to a certain criteria of sustainability. We know that Kaiser Permanente is committed to 100% local and sustainably sourced for all of their food by 2025. So we have very large and fixed institutional commitments to sourcing local and healthy food. Next slide. So given what we know and given this issue of scale and volume demand, what's wide open for input at this point in discussions and conversation with community is, what are the micro businesses that would support MyC with value-added products? For example, we like to say salsas, soups, and sauces. There are a lot of like pestos and salsas and pre-made soups. There's a lot of ingredients that MyC is quite interested in sourcing locally and sustainably. So big opportunity for micro businesses. A producers cooperative, which we're going to talk in more detail, Therese is going to outline for us in more detail in a minute. A producers cooperative to provide and effectively serve as an on-ramp for small-scale urban and regional producers. So, the smallest producer of 1 to 5 acres in Oakland or Richmond should be able to participate and get access to this institutional market under the sort of protection and umbrella of a producers cooperative. So what the cooperative could potentially do is help these small-scale farmers and producers have access to that institutional market where they probably would not have before. And the third component that's kind of wide open for discussion is what are all of those ancillary businesses that are going to help build up a food system infrastructure to service the MyC production facility in Richmond. So some of the ideas that we've been kicking around are, aggregator hubs where an organization will serve as an aggregator hub for 10 to 15 very small and small farmers to bring their product to a central location, potentially have cold storage and other kinds of infrastructure, and then MyC can work with that aggregator hub to pick up product from one location. Another idea is a kitchen incubator, so like Kitchen 812 in Pinole. What are some of those small micro business centers where people who make salsa or sauces or whatever can really hone their craft and get the safety training they need to enter into the institutional market? How can kitchen incubators support these small producers and folks to scale up? And then composting services. So, with all of this food processing, food preparation, and meal preparation, there's going to be a fair amount of composting needed. So perhaps that could be a business that the community owns and develops and manages as an ancillary business to the MyC production facility. So those are just examples. These are things that we all have sort of talked around the table about, but nothing in stone yet. The important thing is that these are things that can be 100% community owned from the get-go and can start soon, given the volume demand that's already there at the South San Francisco facility and what's coming down the road in Richmond by September.
And I'll just add, because we talked earlier about this. This would also include like the building up of greenhouses and aquaponics, which we've mentioned before and have been in conversation with community producers.
Absolutely, thanks. Yeah. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over now to Therese and Sushil to talk about some of the legal structures around this ecosystem and these smaller businesses and producers cooperative.
Lucia, thank you so much. This is Therese Tuttle. That was a great kind of overview and introduction. This slide just has a couple of examples of co-ops. They're both dairy co-ops, which have some very specific attributes. You know, locally here in California, I was very involved with Tri-Valley Growers, which was a large co-op that unfortunately went bankrupt, but it was a good example of combining many different types of products under a single co-op that had different brands, and it also was able to have different sizes of farms, and that's one of the points that I want to mention as we get into the next slide. If you could switch to the next slide. So when we're looking at supplying the needs of FSP or MyC Richmond, we just saw that they're very large procurement needs. Now our dream and our hope may be that many or most or all of these needs could be met by local production. But the fact of the matter is that right now, local farmers don't have the capacity to meet those needs. So how can we keep that door open and support small local farmers in having access to MyC Richmond? So one of the ways that it could be done is to create a producers co-op which would have the ability to incorporate not just regional producers that meet specific criteria, maybe that is set out by Healthcare Without Harm and the purchasing hospitals, but would include a larger geographic area. And so by setting that up now, FSP Richmond or MyC has the ability to have a single point of contract. So rather than trying to contract with many small individual growers, it could just contract with the co-op to meet its supply needs, and that could be, you know, on an expanding basis and with certain benchmarks over time. Again, we saw some of the slides earlier that had sort of a timeline with goals for ownership. We could also have a similar timeline that would illustrate the amount of local, truly local product. So we're all blessed to live here in California, where we have, within a relatively small geographic area, access to incredible organic production. And so that, on the one hand, that's a great benefit because it's there. On the other hand, it makes it a little more difficult for very small local producers who want to get in to be competitive and to be able to get in. So my suggestion here is to organize a co-op such that you could include a larger geographic area and immediately go to work satisfying the needs of FSP, while at the same time keeping the door open and actually having a specific intention around inclusion and bringing up to speed the very local, very small members of the community, especially if there's land available in the community that's in the process of being converted. The co-op itself could incorporate mechanisms for supporting that type of activity. So we have these two challenges that are set forth on the slide here. The first is that we've got a large procurement need that can't be met by the current production capacity of the truly local producers. And then we also have more of a non-contractual aspiration, which is to provide this on-ramp for smaller producers to begin to meet these institutional needs as they develop. And so figuring out a way to actually support those small producers. So solution that I'm suggesting, and maybe we could move to the next slide, is creating a producer co-op, which you see here in the center. Again, we could have done circles, but the producer co-op would be the entity that would contract with MyC Richmond. That would be a master contract that would identify specific food items that would be fulfilled by the producer co-op. How those things would get fulfilled would be done by the co-op's membership. And the membership could have different categories of producers. And they could be from, you know, concentric rings if you wanted to have a layer of geographic selection. And so you'd say that our first preference is for, you know, within 10 miles, and then go out from there. You can also have an overlay that would be other attributes, people from underserved, you know, very underserved communities. And in that way, you're able to build in structurally in the co-op these successive layers of selection for meeting your other goals, while at the same time you preserve on the left that single point of contract with MyC Richmond, which is much more efficient and doesn't necessarily involve Richmond in the support structure for the smaller farmers that you want to support as they're gaining scale and ability in meeting the needs of MyC Richmond. I wanted to also mention that the history of ag co-ops is long and storied in California. And one of the nice things in the ag co-op statute is that there's a specific provision for an outside board member to represent the community or the public. And so I feel that that provision could really come into play here, and an outside board member could be put into the co-op to protect certain provisions that would be set out in the bylaws that would create the framework for achieving the goals of supporting the smaller local producers. So this is just kind of a, you know, not very detailed, high-level overview of possibilities. And I didn't want this possibility to get lost at this stage of the game. I felt like this was an important thing to bring in to suggest that we can achieve the support for the smaller local farmers even without creating a sort of handicap on the contractual relationship between MyC Richmond and its procurement needs, because it will be very cumbersome to have many contracts with many small local producers for MyC Richmond. And I don't think that you necessarily need to do that while still achieving your desire to support the small local producers. So I think that concludes my piece, and I'm happy to answer any questions, of course. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Therese. So that is the completion of the presentation, and thank you all for staying on the phone. As you can see in the production of the legal structure, there's much more to be delved into. I personally got lost a few times with some of the language. And now really it's an opportunity to open it up to those on the phone who have specific questions. I know we have a variety of people on the phone, from institutions to workforce to advocates to FSP. But just for you to bear in mind that we may not be able to answer that question because this is really, we're building this as we go. And a lot of it is still unknown, but we really wanted to set up the frame where everyone can begin to start from the same place of understanding, so that we can start to take away the assumptions and actually look at what's actually existing and then what can be developed. So I believe, Allison, you are in charge of how we commute with the community at large.
Yeah, so so this is Allison. I have my hand on the technical controls of the webinar. So what I'm going to do now is we have 21 people attending, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute everybody. But I want to make sure that if you're, you know, in a place where you've got a lot of background noise, or if you are, you know, there's something else going on and you need to give some attention to something else, that you do go ahead and mute yourself. And so if everybody just looks at the GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see a microphone that probably is showing up either gray or red right now. And I'm going to unmute everyone. Uh-oh, it's not working.
Well, Allison, you muted us all, and then I muted, and then I hit the green button. So maybe it's about.
Okay, so it looks like I have to do it one by one. So I'm one by one going through and unmuting people. And so if you are on, so please go ahead and mute yourself if you are in a place with some background noise. But what we want to do is have this be a conversation, and you do also have the opportunity to type in a question, which some of you have done already. So what I'm going to do, as soon as I get through unmuting everyone, I'm almost done, I'm going to take the couple of questions that have been typed in, and that'll give folks a chance to gather your thoughts. And, you know, just I'll let you know when it's time to jump in if you have additional questions. So so one here that came in was on that chart of the 4 employee ownership options. Somebody asked, what's the difference between the check marks and X's? And so the difference there is, if it's a check mark, it's a yes, and if it's an X, if it's a check mark, it's a yes, and if it's an X, it's a no. So hopefully that answers that question. And then we had a note from Rebecca, and Rebecca, I don't know if you just want to jump in with your comment that you typed in, or I can read it out. Are you still with us, Rebecca? I think so. Yep. So Rebecca said, FYI, FSP will transfer the Richmond FSP stock to the MyC platform, which will be owned by FSC and several nonprofits that may include Emerald Cities, Healthcare Without Harm, GX, who hold community interests. The MyC platform will then add capital to the FSP shares from the Richmond subsidiary, and then transfer the assets/investment into the MyC Richmond entity.
I'm just going to jump in. This is Tara. So Rebecca is helping us with our financing, and although that's you know, welcoming information, it goes to a conversation that will be come up later, because this is about you know, equity and assets and financing and platform, and we're not right there with the community. So thank you, Rebecca, for putting that in. But in this conversation, we really wanted to keep it more high level. So we'll follow up with that input later at a future engagement.
Yeah, the only key point here is just to know that there is a broader entity that will be investing in the MyC enterprises. So just something to keep in mind, and also very much open at this point. I wanted to ask a question. Actually, if you don't mind going to the table where you had the check marks, this is really just a question for everyone on the call, which is that as the entities are set up, is there ever any time where an entity might change its structure, for example, from an ESOP to a trust or a co-op? I'm imagining the answer is no, but I just want to check to say it, or it's highly unlikely. Typically, you would pick a structure and then work within it. Is that right?
Yeah, this is Allison. I can jump in. I think your instinct is right that there's a transition. There's a transition that happens initially from the initial ownership structure to the employee-owned structure, but then transitioning, like from a worker co-op to an ESOP, unless you're doing, in the case of a democratic ESOP, you might have some transitional steps in there. So you could conceptualize, well, maybe the ESOP gets set up first and then the democratic components get rolled in. So you might have some transition steps, but I wouldn't necessarily think that an organization would set up one and then switch to another, unless there was a really good reason or something to prompt that. Sushila, do you have any additional comments on that?
Hi, this is Therese. I was just going to say that, you know, because of the costs associated with setting up an ESOP, it would be unlikely that you would, I mean, it's possible, of course, that you would shift to a trust, but it would be unlikely because you would have made the investment in setting up the ESOP trust already. And so it would be a choice you'd make at the outset, and then I don't think you would go back after that. But I could see a situation where a worker co-op might down the road be converted to a trust just to provide the additional oversight of a trustee. If, for example, a worker co-op wasn't meeting some of its goals and it collectively felt that putting a trustee in place would permanently establish its dedication to community purposes, for example, I could see that happening.
And this is Sushil. If you notice on this spreadsheet, one of the categories is permanent community benefit, and we said sometimes for worker co-op, and yes, we put a check mark for the trust, and that's because the goal when you're setting up the employee benefit trust is that you do not put the shares directly in the hands of the workers. You don't give them the direct governance control. You give them indirect control through the trustee, who has a fiduciary duty to take into account their long-term interests. And in addition, the trustee can take into account the community's interest in preserving and maintaining local jobs. All of that is put into the agreement, the trust agreement. So that's what allows for a trust to be a more, in some situations, it can be a more stable job anchor in the community than a worker co-op.
Sorry, just one more thing on this. In the context of a producer co-op, you know, there was a farmer co-op that was called Dakota Pasta Growers, and the reason why they selected that name was because they were wheat farmers that grew a certain type of wheat that was very good for pasta, and they invested in a processing manufacturing facility and actually created a brand that was all the way to the supermarket. So you could buy Dakota Pasta Growers pasta, and they were very successful. There was a huge amount of USDA contribution, community contribution, setting up that co-op, and the life cycle of the individual farmer members is not perpetual the way a co-op or a corporation would be. And so, you know, as farmers aged and began to look for their retirement, they ended up selling the co-op, and they did very well, so their retirements were well funded. But the problem was that the benefit of having the co-op in the community was lost. And so that's why having that board member in a producer co-op to ensure kind of the long-term stability and presence of the co-op in the community is I think an important attribute, and something to be carefully considered in setting up a co-op.
So Allison and y'all, this is Tara. There's a lot of that came in and then came out, like sections were cut out, and I was thinking it might be send a description of the Dakota co-op and the what happened, so that people can read it, because we missed some of that.
Oh, I'm so sorry. And actually, Tara, you cut out just then too. So if you, maybe we can email your comment to me, and I apologize. Not sure what happened.
Yeah, so I'm going to jump to another question that came in and through the webinar platform typed in, which is, can you share more about the Richmond employees? Are they new local East Bay hires or transfers from South San Francisco? What will their role be in determining the ownership form and structure versus community stakeholders, such as those of us on the call? And then secondarily, what work is underway in building the culture to build capacity for community ownership?
So what I can share is that they're all new hires. They didn't come from FSP. They had a really beautiful set of about 75 people who filled out applications. They interviewed based on schedules around 55 or 60. They said they had an amazing group of people, variety of people, diversity, ethnicities, barriers. They picked 20 based on skill level and leadership capacity, because in speaking and working with the ARC stakeholders, we really said, look, really look for people who can be leaders, can help work with us to build that culture. And to the second question, at this point, they're really just learning. They're aware, obviously, that it's intended to transfer to cooperative ownership, which is why a lot of them applied. But really, right now, we're in the process of how do we begin to set those benchmarks for education, starting in the fall of next year when they come back after their 6-month training and new hires are brought into the facility.
Terrific. So let's open it up to other folks who have questions or comments or thoughts, and you're welcome to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask that, or type it in through
Allison, this is Therese Tuttle, and I just was hoping that we switched to phone. Am I more audible now?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Yeah.
Okay. Should Tara, would you like me to repeat anything that was said and maybe missed?
No, I think the thing is that it's clear that you guys understand like what the Dakota Co-op was, what was the value added, and then the challenge when it was sold, and what was lost in the community. It would be great if you have something, and we would love to have that as a reference and to be able to pass it on to people if they weren't able to hear.
Oh, sure, absolutely.
This is Angela Bizzaro from Food Service Partners. First of all, I would just like to say thank you very much for putting this together, all of you, and for the time that you took putting it together. It's been extremely helpful, and will help us, I think, going forward in terms of how we can best put this structure together. And obviously, we will weigh the pros and cons of each of these different types of structures, and our intent is to come up with the one that works best for everybody.
That's Angelo. He is the, what's your title, president? I don't know. You're one of the owners of FSP.
CEO.
CEO. Thanks, Angelo.
Hi, this is Lydia Bell from UCSF. I had a quick question. I also echo that. Thank you so much for convening everyone, for putting this together. I had a quick question about the ancillary businesses. Excuse me, now that I'm unmuted, you can hear me sniffle. Is there a program in place that actually trains the producers co-op to then, help to support the community, local growers, et cetera? Is there an actual training program that's in place already, or how are those producer co-op trained?
Yeah, this is Lucia. I can start out, and then Tara and Therese jump in. But, there is not a training program set up yet for this producers cooperative. We still need to, we need to have a lot of conversation and discussion with producers in the communities and some entities in Richmond about how this producers cooperative will be structured. But we do have lots of great partnering organizations that can help with things like food safety training, and there's a possibility for GAP certification that can be sort of purchased as an umbrella for the entire producers co-op, so that each individual farmer does not have to go through that process alone. So we know some of the components, Lydia, we just have not set up the training program yet.
Yeah, and I think Lydia is one of our next steps that you'll see for ARC is to bring on a program manager that can actually help direct this. And Lucia and I are holding the governance table and larger conversations to have somebody help direct this, because we do have local food councils. We have like Hope Collaborative, who's done a lot of work. So there are people who expertise of people who have worked with producers. We want to make sure come up front and help us design what is going to be best for urban producers, future producers, as well as small farmers that aren't usually represented or have access.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. I just wanted to see if, Therese, you had any comments in particular about the producers cooperative.
Well, traditionally, the extension service has been a great partner in terms of that type of training. And one thing that's nice about having a co-op structure is that it makes a single point where the partnership with Ag Extension or UC or other partners is possible. It creates the space for that to happen, and in fact can create a structure for it to happen for the members.
Wonderful, thank you. In asking that question, I was really, you guys have addressed it, wonderfully. Thank you. I was really looking to get a sense of, for these smaller businesses, not necessarily just the farmers, but let's say the individual caterers or people, supplying, I don't know, pots and pans to the folks that provide, like, just trying to get a sense of how these folks can then later be trained, because I know that you're looking to aggregate all of those folks so that they can produce at scale. And I'm just trying to get a sense of how best to prepare even those people who don't even have an inkling yet that they can actually join a co-op. So that's where I was going. So thank you. As that develops, I'd love to hear more.
Oh, sorry, we just got muted. That's great, Lydia. We'd love to have your input.
Yeah, and I would say that one of the things that Emerald Cities really targets is pathways, workforce pathways, and that also vendor pathways, like how do vendors who don't get the proper insurance, who don't know how to get the insurance, who don't know how to compete for contracts. We've done that primarily in construction, but with the building of resiliency and localizing sectors, food has become huge across the country. And the thing about the Richmond site is our workforce partner there, Richmond Build, is already asking the state around, really targeting the food sector as a pathway, a directive, like how to actually rebuild it, because it has been, undermined over the last couple of decades.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And I also think, this is Rebecca, I mean, one of the wonderful things about thinking about the producer co-op now at this point and kind of how to structure that is building in this capacity building, whether it's through a set of partners or whether it's through training that's provided by the co-op to co-op members. You can do it in a variety of ways, but actually really getting that identified up front and also resourced so that the small producers aren't disadvantaged as the co-op develops. So, you're planning for a place for them, which is what the co-op structure with its single master contract and planning does. But then if you also have the training support set up so that producers can very easily link into what they need to do in order to be ready for an institutional market, is huge. And that's a real place where community benefits dollars and others, I think, could really come into play, because it's that underlying capacity building that needs to happen.
Right. Just as a time check, because we want to just put last slide up, our next step. So maybe we could take one or two more, and then we'll close it up. Allison.
Sure, sounds good. Yeah, if there are other questions, please go ahead and chime in. Don't be shy. Don't be shy.
Now that I said you have only a last minute to say something.
Well, this is Rebecca. I would just say, take this on the road. It's a great presentation. You guys have done a really beautiful job and very, very helpful and a really nice ground setter. So I just want to say encore, encore.
Thank you, Rebecca. So why don't we just do the next slide, and that might actually bring up some questions.
That's true.
So what we are learning is, both in our long vision and short vision, is really declare what we are doing right now, so that it's in your mind. We are going to get a PDF of this presentation and provide a link to the video. We have a new next step, which is to get the story from Therese around the trust. Not the trust, sorry, the Dakota Co-op that lost its value when it was sold. Now for ARC, our governance objectives, we are committed to getting our community ownership working group up at the end of April, early May, so we can begin to engage around not only the query around the co-ops, but it's also an opportunity to bring in the farmers, because having the producers co-op as the first tangible thing we build, we want to make sure that the farmers, local from 1 acre to 5 acre, as well as some other farmers around, can participate.
And just to add, Lydia, for example, this would be a great space for you to join in and provide your input and insight. We would welcome folks from this presentation and who would like to sit in on those conversations.
And then our next immediate thing that we're looking at is to hire a regional food ARC project manager, somebody who's going to really be an intermediary between MyC, FSP, and the community, as well as the ARC table, because it's when we're looking at ecosystems, it's not linear. It's a circular thing, and a lot of things are happening, and so we really want somebody who can have the capacity to hold this very intentional sector and space that we're creating. And so we really look forward to bringing on somebody in the next couple months, about a month and a half, we'll have somebody up, hopefully.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for participating, and again, please pass this on. This is just, as we said, the ground conversation that we all probably have questions to continue, but I think when we start to have actually the tangible business, it will make things much more specific to ask questions than the experts.
And just want to really shout out to Allison and Sushil and Therese. Thank you so much for your insight and experience and sharing all of your knowledge with us today. I've really learned a
Yeah,
lot.
They've
Sure.
guided us beautifully through this process. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. We
Thank
really
you.
enjoyed it.
Thank you.
We're very excited.
Thank you.
We're
Thank
all
you.
similarly very excited about the project, so glad to see that it's helpful.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
With that,
Thank you very much.
we will go ahead and close out the webinar. Thank you for your participation, and we look forward to your continued involvement.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.